I'm ready whenever. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Orlando Simone. I'm one of the attorneys at the Student Legal Services Office here at the University of Michigan. And welcome to our presentation on It's Not Just a Good Idea, It's the Law for incoming international students. And over the next hour and a half, I'm going to go through some basic understanding of the law and how it might affect you in particular as an international student here at the university. So again, welcome, and we're going to get started here. I'm going to pull up the screen. And before I do that, or as I'm doing that, I should say, I'll just let you know that find it. Um, our service is available to you as students here at the university. As long as you're enrolled in taking at least a class, then you've paid for our service. And what that means is we operate very much like a small law firm. General practice, we don't cover every legal issue, and so there are some things that we might refer you to. But if you had any legal questions whatsoever, our office is the first starting place. You should always contact us, see about scheduling an appointment. I have our website listed, and that's the best way to get a hold of us and request an appointment. We have it set up now that you can request an appointment through our website. There's a specific link. It'll give you more information. It'll give general categories depending on what the legal issue you might think you have, and you can fill that out and we can go from there. If we can't give you more than just general advice, we can at least give you some resources and point you to the direction where somebody else can help you with something more specific. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we get going. So for now, we're going to go ahead and start. And again, you don't need to take notes because this will be available to you through the International Center's website. And I believe there's making a recording, so this might be available too. But throughout the website or throughout the presentation in the PowerPoint, there will be references and links, hyperlinks. Again, you could access that later if you wanted to go back and get some more information. And let's go ahead and get started. So our legal system in the United States is basically broken down into three large categories, or I should say three main categories. Primarily, there's federal law, which is kind of the overarching law, but that's not going to necessarily affect you on a day-to-day basis. So we've got federal laws, federal jurisdiction, federal courts. But more importantly, you're probably going to interact mostly with state courts. And every state has its own laws and therefore its own court systems. And they all might vary just slightly. So that makes it a little bit more complicated. But you're going to be primarily here in Michigan, in the state of Michigan. So Michigan law is generally going to apply. And then underneath state law, we're going to have local laws. And local laws can mean a whole lot of things. So I'll give you as an example, here in the city of Ann Arbor, we have local ordinances or local laws that govern and affect people in the city of Ann Arbor. They wouldn't have jurisdiction or effect outside of the city, okay? And that would be an example of a local law. They also can't supersede or be in contrast with state law above it or federal law above that. So all the systems kind of work underneath each other, and the city of Ann Arbor is not going to grant or take away, can't take away any additional things that federal law or state law would allow or not allow, is the main way to think about it. But most importantly, local ordinances affect you on mostly that day-to-day basis. Another example is, as I cite here, the University of Michigan also is a governmental unit because it's a public university. And under that provision of the law, it can enact its own ordinances for just the campus area. So the University of Michigan regents have, in fact, a series of regental ordinances that affect specific things on campus. And I'll give you some examples of that as we move forward. And the other thing to keep in mind is our legal system is generally divided into civil matters and criminal matters. And we're going to dive into a little bit of that in a deeper way here in just a minute. So Civil law issues are basically everything that affects relationships between private parties. And those private parties could be individuals, they could be businesses, they can even be corporations. But generally speaking, when we talk about civil law, it's something that doesn't involve the government. Okay, and there are certain exceptions to that, but generally this is when somebody enters into a contract. That's the best example for people to understand. Two parties, two or more parties, might come up with a contract, an agreement between the parties for something to happen. And generally that something is going to be purchasing something or a service. And in particular, we're going to go in and look at contracts that affect you as students when you rent a property. Other civil matters that you might encounter that we would take a look at in our office include things like consumer credit card debt, insurance claims, personal damage claims, personal injury claims, family law issues, probate issues. As an example, in our office, we have 5 attorneys, and we would certainly help you take a look at some issue involving credit card debt, or if you had an insurance claim. But depending on the nature of the claim or the issue, we might refer you out, okay? We don't handle personal injury claims, but we can help you evaluate whether you might have one. And then again, we could point you in the direction of resources. One of our attorneys specializes in family law issues and probate issues might involve writing a simple will and assisting you with things like that, okay? And remember, I mentioned that we have different levels of law. In our office, all of the attorneys on board, on staff, are all licensed to practice law in the state of Michigan. So if you came to our office with a dispute that happened outside of Michigan, say it was something happened while you were in Florida, in a different state, or even Illinois, because you went down to Chicago and you got into an auto accident, then Illinois law or Florida law might apply to that situation, and we would not be able to advise you directly on that because I'm not licensed and none of us are in that particular state. So those are just some things to keep in mind. Let's talk specifically about leases. So a residential lease is a type of contract, and it's one that you're most likely to engage in while you're here as a student. I'm going to guess, without a show of hands, that most of you already found a place to live, whether you're living on campus or off campus. If you're living off campus, that means you signed a lease with a landlord or a property owner to rent out an apartment or part of a house to live in. And so it's a contract once you signed it, okay? In the future, if you have any questions about signing a contract, before you sign it, we recommend you contact us and we can help you review it to make sure it complies with local law and state law, okay? But generally, once you sign a lease or any contract and the other party signs it, it becomes a binding contract. And so now you're locked into that specific, or those sets of specific terms. And if you don't agree with certain things, then we recommend that you don't sign it. You can attempt to negotiate those things, but oftentimes the other party, like a landlord, may not be open to negotiating. Those are going to be their standard terms. And so you don't necessarily have a lot of room to bargain like you might if you were on level as a business or another party and both sides wanted something. But the main thing to understand is make sure you read it all the way through. Most people often just sign. They glance at the pages because they don't want to read the whole thing. Or maybe they read something and they think they understood it and they went ahead and signed it. Once you sign it, you're now going to be held to that. And if you have any issues, then it's going to be difficult to get out of that contract. So these are some contract provisions that we've put up. These are general things that we often see that often students come to us with questions about. And these would things we would recommend you always take a look for, okay? When does the lease start and when does it end? Is it a term lease? If it's a term lease, that means it has a beginning date and an end date. And I'm going to pause just for a second. For those of you who are out there, if you don't mind, if you're for some reason unmuted, if you could please mute so we can cut down on the background noise, I would appreciate that. Thank you. So a term lease, as an example, is something that has a beginning date and an end date. Most leases for residences that you sign are going to be a term lease. A month-to-month tenancy is a special kind of lease where it renews itself on a monthly basis, but either party could terminate it with 30 days notice, okay? So if you sign something and it has a begin date and an end date, that's a term lease. What's a little confusing is that term leases will also include a monthly payment. In other words, you signed for a full term of 12 months or almost 12 months, okay? And let's just say you're going to pay $1,000 a month, so you're going to pay $24,000 for the full term, right? The landlord's going to say in the lease, they can't require that you pay all of that in advance by law. So they're going to say you have to pay, we're going to pay it in monthly installments, and we're going to make those equal, and you're going to have to pay the first one before you move in and the subsequent each month, usually at the beginning of the month. So that means if you have a move out date when you move out, most leases in Ann Arbor for students are going to go on the cycle of a semester calendar, and that means they're going to start either at the end of August or beginning of September, right around this time of year, and they're going to continue until next August. But the landlords also want to make sure they have built in a little bit of time to prepare the apartment for next year's tenant if you're not going to renew the lease. So what happens is people will have a move out date, say August 25th, and then they'll say, well, wait a minute, I didn't get a full month's rent, or I didn't get a full month's stay for my last payment of $1,000, but you didn't contract for a full month in August at the end. You contracted for the term and whatever date it ended. So don't get confused by the monthly payments. It doesn't mean you have a month-to-month tenancy. Look to see on your lease when it starts and when it ends, all right? Things like how many people can live there. Local ordinances in the city of Ann Arbor, as an example, would control and have rules about that depending on how big the place is or how small. Is the basement or attic considered a livable space, one where somebody could actually use as a bedroom? Who pays utility bills, late fees, location. And then the last thing I want to address very quickly is joint and several liability, and that's often because people get confused by these terms, and they're almost always in a lease. So if you signed a lease and you have more than one person living there, so you have several roommates, I can just about guarantee that you have a joint and several liability clause or language in your lease, which means that each person who signed is both individually and then as a group together liable for the full amount of the term and for all the terms in the contract. Okay, remember, everybody signed it, so everyone's going to be responsible. And so what that means is, let's say, for example, you have 4 people who decide, okay, let's go get a house, let's go rent out a house, and it's a 4-bedroom house, so we can each have our own room, and the landlord's going to charge us $48,000 for the full term. We can move in on September 1st of this year, and we can move out on August 27th of next year. So it'll be almost a year. And everyone says, great. They sign the lease, and you all move in, and there's joint and several liability. November comes around, and one person is from a southern climate country, and they're saying, wait a minute, no one told me the winters in Michigan were going to be this bad. And so they announced to their other 3 roommates, I'm leaving, I'm withdrawing from the school, I'm flying home, I got a ticket, I'll see you, I'm leaving tomorrow morning, and they leave, and they fly away. And they go back down to wherever they came from, and it's a country far, far away, close to the equator, and you're never going to see them again. Joint and several liability says that the other 3 tenants are still responsible for the full payment, even though they divided it evenly between 4 people and we're only paying $500 each. Now they have to cover whatever that person's 500 in this instance. And let's just say all 3 of 4 people left. One person's the only one still living in the house, joint and several liability. That person's still responsible for the full amount. Now they might have a legal action against the people who left, but good luck in finding them and suing them when they're not even in this country, right? But that's how joint and several liability works. And so you want to make sure you're very clear on that aspect of things. All right, the other things we always recommend is that any agreements you do, you put them in writing. And so if you add things, amend any changes to the lease, you want to make sure everybody signs it and it's added to the actual lease contract. Because if you just make verbal agreements, they're hard to enforce and they may not be considered valid. Even if you have an email, if not everybody signed it, it may be difficult to enforce, okay? Any amenities that you're going to add, say like the lease doesn't describe having a washing machine, and you talk to the landlord and they say, oh, we'll get you a washing machine. Make sure it's noted on the lease and that everybody signs it. And then finally, any communications you have with the landlord, I can't stress enough, you want to make sure you document. So if you have a phone conversation with the landlord about an issue, or you move in and you're pointing things out that should be taken care of, and the landlord says sure, or the maintenance person, whomever, you want to follow that up with an email in writing saying, this is to reference our conversation where you said you would take care of the following issues, etc. Okay? When you move in, if you haven't done this already, you should have received an inventory checklist from the landlord as part of the lease. It's part of the law, the local law that says you should be getting one, and state law as well. And you should get a list and go through and mark all the issues that you have with the place. I also recommend documenting, taking photos of the place, ideally before you move your things in. But if you've already moved in and you haven't done that yet, take pictures, store them, maintain them so that when you move out, you can make sure you document what the place looked like. And if the landlord's trying to charge you for damages or problems that occurred, that you can show, no, this is what the place looked like when I moved in. I noted these problems, I turned them in. Make sure you keep your own copy, make your own copy of that inventory checklist. Other things to think about, the primary one being get renter's insurance. We can't stress that enough. Make sure you get, and usually these are not very complicated. You have to get them through a private insurer, but if you just did a search for renter's insurance Ann Arbor, you'll probably find several options. The main thing here is you're getting insurance to cover your personal property, because the lease is going to have a provision in it that says the landlord's not responsible for loss or damage to your property in the event that something happens that nobody expected. For instance, we had a big storm last night that came through part of our area. Some people are without power. If the storm knocked down a tree and the tree came down and it hit the house, maybe some of the landlord's insurance might cover the damage to the building, but it's not necessarily going to cover your personal property loss. Or if a fire happens, or rain and water damage, or pipes burst, or things like that, okay? Make sure you're making all requests for maintenance in writing, or through, a lot of landlords now have some kind of residence portal or a way to communicate through a website or electronically through email. Make sure you're maintaining copies, keep a log if you're requesting things, and make sure you date when those things happened. You've got a duty to report problems to the landlord. You can't just let them go. Things like security deposit, make sure you're clear. If you don't have if you have questions about that, especially when you're moving out, you can always contact us and we can review that with you. But essentially, there's certain specific laws and timelines around security deposits when you move and how you can get it back. The security deposit is your money, and the landlord's supposed to tell you where they're keeping it. They can't keep it in there underneath their bed and go out and use it to spend and use it for personal. It's supposed to be there as an insurance so that they can cover loss beyond normal wear and tear when you, the tenant, move out, and they can say, well, you broke my refrigerator, and so now it's going to cost me some money to fix it, and I'm going to deduct that from your security deposit, as an example. Okay. General contract things to consider. When you decide you're going to purchase something, we recommend that you're going through a legitimate business. And we're going to talk a little bit about the internet in a second, but the main idea to keep in mind here is generally when you buy something, okay, If you buy a brand new product, like say a computer or something that costs a lot of money, like a car, and it's brand new, okay, items like that usually come with some kind of limited warranty or guarantee that they're, a working product that you're going to be able to use, and it lasts for at least a small period of time. When you buy something used or from an individual, that's going to be considered purchasing something as is, unless it has some written guarantee or warranty in writing that comes along with it. Okay, so as an example, and I'm just going to pick up something right here in front of me. So I have a little video control for a TV or a computer. And if I came along and you said, hey, that looks pretty great, and I said, yeah, it's nice, I'm about to sell it. And you said to me, well, here, I'll give you $10 for it. And it's like, okay, sure. And so I give you this, you give me the $10, and then you take it home and you try it, and it doesn't work with your TV. It doesn't work with your computer. You open up the back and you find it doesn't even have batteries. And then when you put batteries in, you find it still doesn't work. And then you come back to me and say, hey, you sold me a piece of junk. I'm going to say you bought it as is. In other words, I didn't guarantee that it worked, and you gave me $10 and said you wanted it. Okay, so that's as is. And that would apply to buying a used car, especially from just a private individual, or anything for that matter. So always make sure you check, ask questions. Once you buy it, you're usually going to be locked into that, and you're not going to be able to get any money back from the seller. When you're buying a service, make sure you do some homework and check a little research. Most businesses or people who are providing any kind of service have to have some kind of license or certification to be able to sell that good or sell that service. As an example, a beautician. If you go to get your hair cut from a barber or a hair salon, they're supposed to have a beautician's license, and you can always ask to see it. Okay, so make sure you're getting a good or service that's licensed, and usually somebody like that is supposed to have some kind of insurance or some way to cover if there was a problem. So if you were getting a service and it didn't work, so you're not necessarily buying something as is, but there may be some remedy there. But generally, make sure you understand who you're getting the service from, okay? If you have somebody around the corner from where you live cut your hair back in the alley, and then it doesn't go right, or you have problems, that's going to definitely be kind of an as is. Okay, you didn't get it from a licensed individual, and you're going to have a difficult time making any claim. Internet purchases. So here's where we get into other problems, because if you're buying something through the internet and you're not buying something from a viable, credible seller, okay, I won't name any big company names, but pick your favorite that you ever bought something from on the internet, okay, through using a website. If you're using some kind of like specialty used service, and I'll pick Craigslist as an example. If you're not familiar with that, it works similar to the way old classified newspapers would, where you could post things for sale or saying you're looking to buy something. Usually you're buying for an individual, and you may not know. So if it's local, you could always go look. If it's long distance, say through eBay, and you don't really know who's on the other end of the description, then you're taking a big risk, okay? So we recommend, unless it's going to be a lot of money, most payment apps aren't going to guarantee anything or give you any added protection for using the app once the transaction's made. So once you send the money, if you don't get the good back, usually you're going to be out of luck. You can go and file a police report, but most police in one place, like Ann Arbor, aren't going to investigate a crime if they don't know where it occurred, and the most they'll do is allow you to do a report. But usually you're going to be out either the money or the good that you were trying to buy. So let's shift gears, and we're going to talk a little bit about some criminal law. So criminal law essentially are all those types of laws that a government has determined, okay, we're going to criminalize certain behaviors. And so the interaction is between an individual and the government who's trying to say, okay, we're alleging you committed a crime. And here's the description of the crime. And then there's a process that you're entitled to, what we call due process rights in the United States. So we've got a certain kind of federal overhang here of certain protections, but then state law is going to usually apply if it's a state crime, and or local law, and whatever government unit is trying to prosecute or prove that you committed the crime. Okay, so criminal law crimes we're going to divide into two major categories: misdemeanors and felonies. First, we're going to talk about misdemeanors. And a misdemeanor is essentially, by definition, a crime that the legislature has determined is of lower import, so it has less degree of severity, and therefore we're going to say the punishment's going to be less. And so any crime that by its definition is punishable by less than 1 year in jail, okay, because a crime has to say, okay, this is a 90-day misdemeanor, you could be punished up to 90 days, or you could be put in jail. That's going to be a misdemeanor. If it were a year or more, then it would fall into a felony category, which we'll talk about in just a few minutes. Okay? And primarily, people aren't going to jail for misdemeanor crimes, especially if it's a first offense. Usually there are options, some kind of resolution where maybe you can work through the system, get an attorney like our office to help represent you, and we can usually come up with some resolution. And you might have to do some probation, maybe some community service, and pay a small fine, okay? And that's usually about the biggest severity that we see with the majority of cases. Now, there are many, many things that could be considered a misdemeanor crime. And the problem is there are a lot of laws, some of them are old ones, that you may not be familiar with, especially coming from another country. And you might think, okay, in my country, that's not illegal. So just make sure you're very cautious and careful, because if you commit something and get charged, then the local government is going to say, well, ignorance is no defense to what the law is written. We assume that you're going to be out here, so you should be familiar with what is a crime and what isn't a crime. So we have a picture of a railroad track for a reason, and that is because a lot of people don't necessarily associate a railroad track with a crime. If you look at this picture, you'll see space on either side of the railroad tracks and then down the middle. So as I like to say, if you're walking alongside the track and you're within as close as any of those stones are on either side, or if you were to cross the track or walk down the middle of this track, that would be a crime. It'd be a criminal misdemeanor called railroad trespass in Michigan. So it's a state law. And this goes back to a time when railroads were predominant in our country and in our country's history. And so there are a lot of reasons that those laws came about. The main thing to consider now is that primarily it's one of safety. And so you might see people doing that, but if you do it and you're not crossing the track at a properly marked crossing, railroad crossing for foot traffic or a car, then you might get stopped and ticketed by the police. So that's just an example. Now, the majority of things that we deal with and we see through students coming to our office and things that they get charged with are going to be related to alcohol. Some of you might not drink, but you just still have to be aware of what a lot of the local laws are. The main thing is, if you're 21 or older, then you can possess or consume alcohol in legally acceptable places. If you're under 21, it's illegal for you. You're considered a minor in terms of possessing or consuming alcohol or purchasing alcohol for that matter. And so it doesn't really matter where you are, okay? You could be in violation of that criminal law. The big thing I want you to understand here is what constitutes an open container. You might see people walking around, especially this weekend or in subsequent weekends, especially anytime there's a home football game, and they might be carrying red cups or any kind of container that is obviously open. In other words, it doesn't have a top and people are drinking from it. And so that would be an obvious example of an open container, okay? But what happens when you have a container that you purchased from the store, and let's just say there's wine or any kind of spirits in here, okay, some alcoholic beverage, and I bought this from the store. And once I take the top off and open, I've broken the seal of the container, okay? Now I might take a drink and I might put the top back on and I close it. And so nothing's coming out, it's sealed, but the fact that the seal's been broken and some of the liquid has been consumed means it's an open container. So if I walk out into a public place, like a sidewalk or a street, carrying my now opened and closed, reclosed container, that would be considered an open container just as much as an open cup or any other container that has no lid. So that's the main thing to keep in mind, okay? What open containers mean. And if you're carrying something and you're in a public area, sidewalk, street, or anywhere else, that would be considered an open intoxicants charge. And most places will have local ordinance against that. And that would be a crime. You'd get a ticket for that, okay? You could be in a restaurant or a cafe that might have a license to use part of the sidewalk for their business, and then you'd be okay. But if you got up and you walked down the street carrying your container to go put more money in your car meter, as an example, or to greet a friend and you stepped outside of that area, you would be in violation and you'd be in a public area with a container and it would be a crime. We talked about underage. The other thing to consider here is that even if you're 21 or older, if you provided alcohol to someone who's underage, a minor, that could also be a crime. Driving and then, or drinking and then driving could be a crime if the police can demonstrate in some way or have reason to believe you could be intoxicated while you drove, or that you could be under the influence while you drove and it impaired your ability to drive. And then that, of course, gets more serious if you injure somebody or you killed somebody. If you had an accident and somebody got hurt or died, you could get charged and it would become more than a misdemeanor. It would become a felony in the case of killing somebody. And it would all be related to the alcohol, and they could prove that your alcohol level was over the legal limit. That could be a serious offense, okay? The other thing is the last item here. If you're stopped by the police, you must give them a sample of your breath to determine if you're intoxicated. So if the police have some reason to believe that you might be intoxicated, okay, such that they could give you a breath test, you've already implied your consent to that because you're driving in Michigan and that's part of state law. And then in turn, if they have some evidence to suggest that your blood alcohol level is 0.08 per milliliters, so this is a designation that's accepted, then they could say legally, you're over the legal limit and we're going to arrest you for operating while intoxicated. If your blood alcohol content is greater than 0.17, then it's a more serious charge of being operating while intoxicated plus, or sometimes called super drunk, okay? And even if it's less than that, you could be considered visibly impaired if your ability to operate was somehow impaired. In other words, if you ran a red light or if you swerved over lanes or you bumped into another car, anything that shows that you were somehow impaired or your ability to use the vehicle was impaired, and then it was determined that you'd had at least a drink, you could be charged with that lower level offense. I've recently had somebody contact our office about public urination. They got charged with urinating in public. And especially this time of year, where a lot of students on campus, people are excited about being back. There are a lot of number of parties and social gatherings where alcohol is consumed, and then people are walking home and they're looking for a place to urinate, and they often will think if I go behind a bush or a big trash bin, I should be okay. That's still going to be considered in public and in public view, and so you could get ticketed and charged for that. Just a note, remember when I talked about different crimes depending on where you are. So if you're in the city of Ann Arbor and you urinate in public, that would be a criminal misdemeanor. If you happen to be on the University of Michigan campus and you're observed by the University of Michigan police, you would get ticketed for a civil infraction for the same offense, but a different jurisdiction, different place, okay? And that would be if you got charged by the University of Michigan police as opposed to the Ann Arbor police. But just as an example of being, certain places could change the outcome a little bit. But most people, you're going to see this. Don't think you can get away with it, because usually you're not paying attention to who's out there paying attention to you. And so that's where the problem usually occurs. If you're having a party, you have certain things to consider as a host, okay? How intoxicated are your guests? Are your guests underage? If something happens. So as an example, somebody might come to your party and have driven there, and then you can tell that they're obviously had a lot to drink and they could be very intoxicated. And then if you let them leave and drive home knowing that, and they have an accident, you could be liable or responsible. You wouldn't necessarily be responsible for their arrest for drinking and driving, but if something got more serious, there could be liability attached to you as the host, because you have a certain duty to make sure your guests are safe. The same is true of alcohol poisoning. And we've seen this unfortunately happen in the past, but sometimes people get very intoxicated and maybe somebody says, well, we'll just put them in the back room, or they pass out, meaning they become unconscious because their alcohol level is so great. And that in turn could be a sign of potential alcohol poisoning. I've listed University of Michigan or the University Health Services web link here to descriptions of what alcohol poisoning might look like and how to deal with it in terms of contacting an EMS, some kind of medical assistance emergency. Loud noises. In the city of Ann Arbor, it's a criminal misdemeanor to have a loud noise coming from your residence after 10 p.m. up until 7 a.m. There are also certain noise ordinances for just loud disturbances, like if you had a loud party in the middle of the day, the police could issue a ticket without having a complaining person. Sometimes people will complain, call the police will show up, they'll ask for somebody, and they'll write a ticket without asking any questions, and then you have to go deal with it with the prosecutor, with the local prosecutor. But just know that that's a crime. It may not be a crime where you come from. Briefly, let's talk about marijuana. Those of you who use marijuana, maybe you were excited to hear you're coming to Michigan, and Michigan has legal recreational marijuana, which it does in limited aspects. We also have laws making it permissible to use marijuana for medical purposes. But again, you have to be able to have a license for that, a medical marijuana license, which means you have to have a doctor sign off on what your medical condition is and that it can be alleviated, or that you're being prescribed marijuana to control or help with that medical issue. Recreational marijuana, if you're 21 or older, you can purchase in small amounts for personal use. However, all of this is based on state law. And so another example of how federal law, overrides or supersedes state law. So far, we haven't seen any cases where the federal government has been pursuing people in states where recreational marijuana is now available and partially legal, but they could, And as international students, you all have to keep in mind that any charge related to drug use could impact your immigration status. So most of you are here with an F1 visa. It could impact the issuing of new visas. I can't tell you whether or not it might impact, taking away a visa. For those of you who are getting some kind of financial aid, sometimes that becomes an issue if it's coming from the federal government. And here on the University of Michigan campus, the university's policy is to follow federal law, and so they're going to consider any use of marijuana on campus illegal under federal law. So just to keep that in mind, those of you who are old enough that you could purchase it through a licensed facility, it still might have impact on you in other ways. Okay, so caution there. Some general things to keep in mind. Some of these are misdemeanors, some of them not, but also would kind of fall into the category of, okay, be careful here. No smoking anywhere on campus. It's not necessarily a crime, but there are policies, and you could run into some problems for violating the just the statement of student rights and responsibilities on campus. If you pulled a fire alarm for a joke, that would be a crime. Um, Throwing trash, littering could be a criminal charge or a civil charge, depending on the nature of what happened. If there are any new COVID-19 restrictions or advisories that get put into place, either locally or at a state level, failure to observe those could result in fines. We saw that happen initially. And then the big thing I want to talk about is going back up to retail fraud or shoplifting. This would be considered a theft crime. And so even if it's a misdemeanor crime, it could have some more serious implications for people who are international students because it's a fraud or theft crime and viewed differently by immigration and federal immigration authorities. So if you take an item and you're not paying for it from a store and you attempt to leave without paying for it, you're usually going to get stopped. Most of the big stores in the area have pretty sophisticated internal surveillance or closed circuit TVs now. So they're constantly monitoring, especially large, multi-purpose stores. I'll use as an example Target or Meijer. Those are names you might encounter as students here because they often have lower prices. Walmart is another example. Any of these large stores and even smaller ones are always going to be on the lookout for people trying to take things without paying. If you ended up doing that and you got ticketed and charged and the police called, make sure you call us and don't make any statements, but obviously you don't want to be in that position, and just understand that even though it's a misdemeanor crime, it could have more serious consequences as a result. So now let's talk about more serious offenses, and these are felonies. So remember, I mentioned that felonies are crimes by definition that are punishable by more than a year in prison. And notice there's a distinction between jail and prison, which is why you have this photo here, which would be a photograph of a prison, and it's a more serious institution designed for, higher level of security, people who are going to be there for potentially a long time. Obviously not a place that any of us want to go to or have a reason to go to, but just so you're aware of what that distinction is versus a jail, which is usually a local, lower security, temporary holding place. Most people aren't going to be there for more than, say, a few weeks, the majority of them. Rare that someone's going to be in jail for months at a time. And so just so you understand, that's part of the distinction. So examples of felonies, theft crimes, taking things that don't belong to you without permission. Typically, and it says here with a value of $200 or more, which given the fact that we now have inflation rampant in this country, as well as prices that have risen, laws are old. And so there was a time probably when that was written where $200 was a lot more than it means today to most people. But the law still says if it has a higher value, typically, $200 to $1,000, and 1,000 or more starts getting more serious. Theft crimes are all, the degree of them are enumerated by the value of the item taken. But in general, if you're going to take things, most of them have a higher dollar value, and you'll probably get charged with a felony. Even possessing or using somebody else's credit card without their permission is a felony charge. Remember we said, defined by the maximum time in jail, those are 4-year felonies in most cases. Any violent crime resulting in injury. So if there's an assault, which we're going to talk a little bit about in a minute, and there was a weapon used or somebody was seriously injured and they had to go to the hospital, that would most likely get charged as a felony. Drunk driving, typically a misdemeanor crime. If it resulted in death, we mentioned this earlier, could be a felony. So consequences, just to pause here, in general, okay, if you commit a felony crime, it means that you could get charged by the state of Michigan. You could get charged by the US government, because usually the government's not charging you with local misdemeanors. You also could result in some kind of sanctions from the University of Michigan. The Office of Student Conflict Resolution, which I mentioned, um, helps to implement and enforce the Statement of Student Rights and Responsibilities. So you may want to become familiar with that if you haven't taken a look already. It's available to you online. And so just by getting charged with a crime, you could also face separate independent sanctions through the university that might impact your status as a student. If it were a very serious crime, it could result in suspension and or expulsion from the university. And as international students, you also have to always think about any crime, the charge, and what the impact it could have on your status as an international student. So in other words, your immigration status. Okay. You have to keep in mind that if it's a felony and more serious misdemeanor crime, usually those gets reported to the Department of Homeland Security now as part of a national database on criminal activity and ICE. So if ICE gets notice that you have been charged with a felony crime, then they might come and attempt to pick you up and take you to immigration detention. So obviously things get more serious. So again, these are links here that'd be available to you through the International Center, through the website where we were posting this after we're done. But just to keep all those things in mind. Other consequences, as I mentioned, immigration status can be affected by, and here you have to understand that there's a distinction. Now, I'm not an immigration attorney, but there is a distinction between felonies and misdemeanors for regular criminal law purposes and felonies and misdemeanors and certain descriptions of crimes for immigration purposes. So it could be a misdemeanor and still by immigration definition be considered an aggravated felony or similar charge. And anything that is a crime of moral turpitude could also affect your status. So it gets a little murky, which is why you'd want to have an immigration law attorney who specializes in this and properly advise you. And by the way, our office does provide international students with an immigration panel. We don't have somebody who's permanent and full-time staff, but we work with a panel of immigration attorneys locally if we have an issue that requires an immigration consult. So you can always contact our office to find out more about that. But if you're in any of these situations, you want to make sure you reach out and talk to us, and definitely get the advice of an immigration attorney. Now, let's talk a little bit about domestic violence issues, which are going to be a little bit separate than the discussion about general misdemeanors and felonies. I'm going to start really quickly with an understanding of assault and battery. So an assault is a crime that means you've put somebody else in fear that they could be harmed. An assault doesn't mean that you've got to make contact with somebody, bodily, physical contact. When you raise a fist and come and attempt to hit somebody, just that motion and attempt could be considered an assault. Once you make contact with another body, that's the battery. So one could get charged with an assault or an assault and battery, depending on the circumstances of what happened. So if you get into an argument and somebody starts yelling and raises their voice and maybe picks up an item and attempts to come at somebody or throws something and doesn't hit them, that's an assault, okay, or could be. If they make contact, that's an assault and battery. So it could make the charge a little bit more serious. Now, when you add a domestic relationship, it becomes a different level of criminal charge called domestic violence or domestic assault, okay? And that means that it could be a family relationship, it could be a dating relationship, it could even be a roommate relationship, any relationship where it shows that it's more than just a day-to-day or even a friendship. It would have to be something that's, you know, either people live together or they're part of a family or they're somehow connected in a deeper relationship way. Then if that same activity occurs, it's not just an assault or an assault and battery, it's a domestic assault. and you get charged. Immigration considers that a more serious offense. Most often people are going to be arrested, and somebody's going to be arrested, and then you got to start dealing with a case, and it rapidly escalates. If you're on the other end of that, on the receiving end, and you feel like you're the victim of some abusive relationship, you could file a civil action to get protection from the court, called a personal protection order. And that's something our office can help you with, as long as it doesn't involve another student. But there are also other resources available if we had a conflict. These situations, as I said, can escalate very quickly. If you're living on campus, it could result in immediate expulsion from a residence hall. You could face additional academic, legal, and immigration proceeding sanctions, as we described before, because this would fall into that kind of area of similar to an aggravated felony or a crime of moral turpitude. Okay. Now, we'll talk a little bit about stalking, which is a specific type of crime where somebody's activity or behavior goes beyond just a casual interference or being obnoxious to starting to make somebody feel intimidated, harassed, somehow afraid, worried, concerned for their own safety. Okay. So there could be that personal protection order piece, but usually this is the area that's a little more gray. And the best way to describe this is this following scenario. One person's sitting in class one day, and they look down, and down on the front row of the lecture hall, somebody else comes in. It's a new student, and they're like, oh, that person, they're pretty cute. And then they come up and they bump into them later and say, hi, maybe you'd like to go get a coffee with me or some tea. And they say, sure. And then they go, and person A really thinks this is going to go somewhere. And person B feels like, this person, they're nice, but I don't really have any interest. Person A doesn't pick up on that, and they continue to persist. Maybe they go out on a date or two, maybe they don't. Person A continues even after person B says, I don't really want to have anything more, let's just be friends. Person A continues to show up. Maybe they show up to the workplace. Maybe they start following the person's class schedule. Maybe they have their phone and they text them all the time, all hours of the day. Maybe they find out where they live and they start showing up at their house. Maybe they keep buying gifts and leaving them for them. Anything that starts to become harassing behavior where the other person, again, feels intimidated, harassed, threatened, fearful for their own safety, and they're not sure about the other person, that could be considered stalking. They could call the police, file a report if it's a continued, repeated type of activity, or it includes a variety of different activities. Okay, which means that there's unconsented contact. There's contact that the other person has either said, don't, please leave me alone, or it's implied that they don't want to be bothered anymore. And these are some of the things I just discussed: following or appearing in their site, coming to their workplace. So you just really have to pay attention to what people are saying. And this doesn't necessarily involve any physical contact. This is just, relations between different people and how those relations are perceived. So if it's an unconsented contact, in other words, people say, don't send me any gifts, don't text me, don't call me, stop showing up at my class, stop showing up at my house, then that means don't do it anymore. And if you continue to do it, then it starts to become a pattern, and that could be considered a crime or result in a criminal charge. Sexual assault, this is not going to go in, this presentation isn't going to go into a lot of detail because there's a different unit being presented to students through the university about sexual assault and sexual abuse. But the most important thing to understand is that sexual assault's a very serious set of crimes. There are a number of different types of crimes, and there doesn't have to be actual penetration or physical penetration. It could just be an attempt or just basic sexual contact, depending on the nature of the event. It could be very serious to partially serious, but all of these things are going to result in big immigration consequences, and they're going to bring with them a lot of other consequences, as I already talked about, in terms of potential expulsion, suspension from school, and they'll be treated very seriously. If you feel like you're the victim, there are resources on campus. I list a few here. 911, of course, is the emergency number to contact the local police. There's a SAPAC office, which is the Sexual Assault Prevention and Awareness Center here on campus as a resource. And these things you probably have heard in other presentations and being made available to you, but it's worth highlighting again. University of Michigan Police Department, there's also blue light emergency phones throughout the campus. If you start looking around, you'll see them in case you felt like you needed to make a quick call. For those of you who have minor children, I'm just going to touch on this briefly, and then you can always go back and look at this slide, but there could be criminal charges based on, leaving your child unattended, depending on their age, leaving children in the car without any access to air, especially on a hot or very cold day. If they're under 6, they can't be left unattended at all. You can't leave them in a stroller outside of a store. Things, again, that may or may not be a problem where you come from or culturally, but here they're going to be very serious. These are not necessarily crimes, but certain types of driving could result in getting tickets if you intend on driving. Number one, I would say make sure you have a valid driver's license. You could have a valid driver's license from your home country. You have to make sure if it is that you carry with it a translation in English. It is in English and understood if you were to hand it to an officer. If you're going to be here for more than 6 months, I recommend that you just go to the Michigan Secretary of State's office and just apply to get a Michigan driver's license. It will make life a lot easier. If you have to get a car, just make sure you've got it properly registered and insured. If you get pulled over, you want to make sure you pull over safely and quietly and as quickly as possible. Then you want to make sure you keep your hands on the steering wheel, relax, so that the officer can see them, and allow the officer to approach. And then you can ask, what can I do for you? And they're going to ask to get your paperwork and take a look. And then they're going to talk to you about why they pulled you over. Okay. If you try to argue, if you try to make quick, sudden movements, you're going to make everything worse. Don't attempt to offer money or do something that looks like a bribe. That would be illegal too and not accepted. We've got some officers who will set up and look for people to ticket, and maybe they'll be in certain areas on a regular basis. This happens both on the highway system, where we have the Michigan State Police, and it happens locally. So if you do drive, just make sure you observe the posted speed limits and you won't have any issues. If you're going very fast, or if you think you're going to go the same speed as other people who are going very fast and that will be okay, and you get stopped, just be prepared to get a ticket. Now, we do not represent people in traffic court. We can give you some resources and advice, but generally, if you get a ticket, most times there's not really any defense or argument to be made, because the officers are generally not issuing tickets to people who don't deserve them. So just keep in mind, again, follow the speed limit and observe the regular rules, and you should be fine. Crosswalks, especially close to the campus area. When classes get out, you're going to see a lot of people crossing, and sometimes you may be waiting for a very long time if you're in a vehicle. Pedestrians have an absolute right of way to make a cross, especially at a crosswalk. Don't try to go through the crosswalk while people are there. If you get tired and frustrated, you've got to wait. Okay. If you're crossing the street as a pedestrian and you're not using a designated crosswalk, if a car hit you, you might not have a very good case to say that you weren't supposed to be in the street and they should have stopped. But if you are driving, it doesn't give you a license to hit somebody, but just understand that crosswalks, don't try to get around them, okay? The same is true if you're passing an emergency vehicle that's been stopped on the side of the road. This is something that especially the police are going to come after and ticket you as well for passing. So you've got to make sure If it's just one lane, you slow down, move as far over as you can, that's safe. If there are multiple lanes, you can move over to the far lane. What you don't want to do is go right next to that officer, especially very fast. If you have to go close, go down and move super slow, put on your blinker, and then proceed with utmost caution. Other things to consider while you're driving. It is a crime to text while you drive, so you don't want to be on your phone. There are other things that it's not necessarily illegal, but you just want to avoid doing anything with your hands that is going to take your attention away from driving, that could potentially cause an accident or some other issue while you're driving. Eating, putting on makeup, combing your hair or brushing your hair. Reading, believe it or not, I see sometimes people reading a book while they're the only person in the car driving. So just make sure you're doing driving and not anything else when you're driving, and then that should be fine too. Parking tickets. If you park anywhere in the city of Ann Arbor, meters now are all automated. They use like a kiosk. You park, there's a numbered spot. You can get an app and you can do it from your phone, or you can go to any one of those little kiosks and then you can put money to feed your meter. Most meters will have like a 2-hour maximum limit, and then other cities it might differ, but just know that if you try to park there and don't pay, Ann Arbor is very serious about traffic parking enforcement, and so they will issue tickets. If you ignore the ticket, it could have impact on your driver's license, and you might get a suspension if you haven't paid it over a long period of time. It could go to collections. It could get more expensive. So if you do get a ticket, just pay it. If you want to contest it, you can go to the city of Ann Arbor and you can ask about getting a session with a parking referee to contest it, but you've got to have a pretty good argument to say that, other than I ran out of money. So those are some general things. Parking in no parking zones, pay attention, especially if you park in a handicapped parking area and you don't have a handicapped parking permit, you will get ticketed and fined, and your car may get towed. Okay? Keep in mind, for those of you who do drive, we see this every year in the wintertime during the winter holiday break, where students will leave and go home and they'll leave a car and they'll park it on the street. If you leave your car unattended for a long period of time, usually it's more than, I think, 3 days, depending on where you're parking, but anywhere on the street, off-street parking, or on-street parking is called, your car could be subject to towing. And this happens usually in the case where we were expecting a big snowstorm and then they have to get the snow plows out, and then they post signs and you're not here because you're gone for 2 or 3 weeks, and they post signs saying, please, everybody, no parking on the street for the next 2 days. And if they find a car there, they tow it. And then you come back, you can't find your car, and then you have to find out where it is, and then it's sitting in a tow lot, and the tow company is going to be charging you daily for storage plus the fee to tow. So at a minimum, if you go get your car right away, it's probably around $300 now for towing and initial storage. If it stays there for many days, that price could go up very quickly. So if you're going to leave a car, make sure you're leaving it in a place where it's attended, somebody can move it, or it's in a privately held space that you have permission to park there. All right. Let me get just quickly on immigration things. We've talked and touched a little bit on these things, but in general, you want to make sure that you're aware of basic regulations. You've got the International Center, obviously, as a resource. I already mentioned you can contact our office to see if you could get a consultation with one of our immigration attorney panelists if your situation warranted that, and or referrals to somebody who could assist you with, an issue like, okay, I'm going to be graduating and I want to look at changing my visa status, or I'm going to be getting a job and working with an employer to change your visa status as part of that job application process. But in general, some folks may be trying to be helpful at the university, but if they're not an immigration attorney, which they aren't, then just be cautious of any advice you receive and don't rely on that, because immigration regulations change, the law changes, there are small changes that people may not be aware of. And so somebody might be trying to give you valid advice from, say, a year ago, based on somebody else's experience, but that's changed now. So just be aware of that. Some general safety tips to keep in mind when you're around. Even though Ann Arbor is a pretty safe city, not a high crime rate, there's still crime. If you're coming from a place where it's perfectly fine to walk alone at night, just maybe start rethinking that here. There's Safe Walk, which I believe is still a service run voluntarily by students here on campus. There's a number listed for that. You could double check that, but I believe that's still valid. But things like common sense. Don't leave your apartment door, even if it's closed, unlocked if you're not there or nobody else is present. The same with cars. If you're studying at any of the buildings on campus that are open, don't set up and then go to the bathroom or leave to go get a coffee and then come back and expect that all your things will still be there, because even in those spaces, there are people who can come in and take things. Not necessarily students, but we see it happen. Small theft from libraries and areas, things like that. If you're using any cash machines, getting cash, because that's the only way to pay for something as opposed to with your phone or with a credit card, just make sure you're using a place that's safe, that has lights, especially at night, and that people can't, see you putting in the numbers, or take extra precautions. Identity theft. This is a situation that is often hard to detect because you may not know that you're the victim of identity theft until after it's already happened. And usually, since this is done long distance and anonymously, it's hard to even find out or prosecute somebody who's doing it. Sometimes identity theft happens through somebody you know. Oftentimes there's a whole category of identity theft that is perpetrated by other family members or partners. In other words, people who have access to all your personal information. But oftentimes we'll see it through the internet, meaning somebody's obtained information that has been picked up through, using the internet, because there's so much out there now, and they've put together enough information to create a false identity using your identifying information for the purpose of, saying, establishing another credit card in your name or creating a bank account. And then obviously you won't know about it until the bank starts looking for payment on the money. But if you feel like you've been the victim of something, contact our office. We can walk you through resources and some things you can start doing. The Safe Computing page on the Internet Technology Services, part of the University of Michigan, offers another set of great resources and tips if you're not familiar with what this would mean, and some good preventative advice. Fraud and scams. So in addition to identity theft, this is often where people will get information. International students in particular, we find, are often subject to more than the usual. I'm not quite sure how anybody would know that you're an international student, but regardless, just be aware of things that come through your computer. People asking you for information, either by the phone or on the computer. Banks, governmental agencies, universities, they're not going to contact you and ask for you to verify or click on a button. Usually that's an indicator that's a scam, okay? If you get a call and you don't know where it's coming from, or somebody don't respond, you can always contact to verify. You don't have to go through them. These are some resource links that describe things in more detail. But generally, you just want to pay attention and use some common sense. So these are some big examples that we've seen over the years. If someone sends you a check for more money than you asked for, and then they tell you to cash the check and give them a balance. So this often happens in the context of somebody say, I'm going to sublet my apartment for a few months. And somebody says, oh, I saw your ad and I want to rent the apartment. I'm going to be there for the summer doing graduate work. It's perfect. How much? And they just seem very agreeable about everything. And then they are going to send you money and they say, tell you what, my uncle just gave me this check. to use for the payment, but he overwrote it. So it's for $5,000. I owe you two. I'm going to send it to you. I trust you. If you'll cash it and then send me back by wire $3,000, then that's the easiest way for me to do it because I no longer have a bank. Some story. You get the check, you put it in your bank, you wire them the $3,000, and then 3 days later, your bank calls and says that check you deposited is fake. In other words, it has no value. It didn't go through. It bounced. Whatever you want to say, but the bank's going to now say you owe them $5,000 for the total amount because you withdrew the $3,000 and sent it. So that's a scam, typical. Somebody offers you a job through email or text saying, hey, we've got this great job for you. You can do while you're a student. You can do it at home. It's got flexible hours. Here's how you do it. Call us on this separate line, send a different email, and we'll set you up with an interview. That's usually going to be a way to get you to start sending them money. It sounds really good, but it's going to be a scam. If someone calls you claiming to be the police or government official and then demands money to clear up a problem, or you've got problems with the IRS, or you've got problems with any governmental agency, again, those are all indicators of the scam. You need to hang up. My best advice is if somebody calls you and you don't recognize the number, let it go to your voicemail, see if they leave a message, and you can always call them back. You don't have to respond automatically and immediately because usually if somebody's calling your phone and you don't know the number, it's usually going to be a scam. So I want to just touch on digital copyright violations and the potential for issues here. For those of you who are coming from a place where you might be using any kind of peer-to-peer software, just know that the software itself is not illegal, but using it, depending on your use, could be illegal. And essentially, it could be violating copyright. So this is federal law. This is that top layer of law. US copyright law basically protects anybody's creation of a work, whether that's written or a painting or a song or a poem or a movie. Anytime anybody creates any kind of work, whether they sell it or publish it or not, that person owns the copyright. What happens is most artists will work with a studio or some kind of larger corporation that has access to some of those copyright. In other words, they might pay the artist, but they own the copyright. That's the deal they made. And so it's the larger companies that are enforcing copyright violations when people stream, meaning upload or download, versions of copyright protected works. And these are all obviously done without paying for them. And so these can be detected. The level of sophistication for detecting these things has gotten pretty good over the years, and there are still some groups that are trying to enforce copyright once they find out. So how does this work? If you're not familiar with peer-to-peer or some kind of file sharing service or app, usually people will have installed it, used it somewhere. Maybe it was legal, maybe it wasn't, and now you're here on campus. If you don't know how to work that system very well, it's probably going to be in a default mode, which means that even when you're not using it, it's available and running anytime you open up your computer or your device. So it's running in the background. And then you'll be sitting in class and somebody using that same network and that same file sharing service is going to be looking for something. And if it's on your computer and it detects and it pulls at least part of that file and uploads it and sends it out, and somebody tracks it, then the university is going to get notice of it. They're in turn going to contact you and they're going to say, we got this notice that somebody's saying you violated their copyright. It's pretty easy to determine based on individual device computer identifying numbers and where you logged on and how you did it, even now through the Wi-Fi, that it's pretty easy to trace. So my recommendation is that if you want to avoid any issues with copyright, you get rid of or uninstall the peer-to-peer that you're using, unless you're very aware and you are on it and you're monitoring how that thing works and how to use it and how to turn it on, turn it off. Because again, it's not illegal in and of itself. It does have legitimate purposes. but the majority of folks who are using them and getting into trouble are using them for what I just described. And as the previous slide indicated, $750 is the minimum for each individual violation. So if you're caught uploading, 10 different song titles from one album, $750 times 10 could be $75,000 in copyright violations civilly, and then you could also be subject to potential criminal violations. I've listed here a link here called the Creative Commons, which is a place for preemptive sharing of licenses by academics, by artists. And so you can always start there. You can also look for, copyright free or open source type licenses that are available through the internet if you have any concerns. So we're going to wrap things up, and I'm going to let you know that this presentation is just general overview of the legal system in the United States, and hopefully some information helpful about how it might affect you as an international student here at the university on campus. It's not intended to be specific legal advice. If you had any questions, then go onto our website, request an appointment, as I mentioned before, and we'd be happy to sit down with you individually. Please note that any attorney that you talk to is going to be bound by rules of attorney-client privilege, meaning that anything we discuss is always confidential. So we aren't part of the rest of the university in terms of reporting anything out. You'd have this conversation with any attorney, and any attorney would be bound by the same rules and obligations. So as a starting place, anything that we discuss is always going to be done individually and in a confidential manner. So again, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you had any further questions or wanted to go back and look at things, it will be available on the International Students website. I'm going to stop the screen share, and if anybody has just some basic quick questions, I'll take a few through the chat for the next 5 minutes or so. I'll hang out, and if you've got anything specific, but I'm not going to be able to answer a specific legal matter that you might have. So I would again direct you to our website to make an appointment.